Everything began with a cloud of dirt and a piercing shriek so sharp it made a grazing bull freeze mid-bite. My spouse had just finished her morning animal care routine when the peaceful quiet of our property shattered like a thunderclap. A high-end SUV ripped down the dirt driveway as if it were a speedway, throwing up debris and causing our hens to scatter in panic. Then came the banshee wail from the vehicle, reverberating across the field like some evil spirit had taken control of a Cadillac Escalade's horn. I glanced up from the stable and spotted her, the Homeowners Association president herself, standing in stilettos on our weathered ranch ground, brandishing a clipboard in one hand while gesturing wildly with the other. There she stood hollering at my wife's face directly in front of our stable, screaming about unauthorized paint choices, community standards, and her personal contempt for wind turbines. What she failed to grasp was that our ranch existed outside her OA boundaries, but reason held no weight with Karen on that particular day. She had declared battle and selected the wrong territory. The day had begun like countless others. I was busy fixing the hinges on the southern paddock entrance while my wife Leah was gathering the goats that persistently escaped into the dog area. We had possessed our property for a decade, constructed every fence post with our own hands, and managed our share of intrusive neighbors and expensive city dwellers relocating from distant states. However, we had never faced anything comparable to Karen. She had relocated to the new development that curved around our property's rear boundary roughly 3 months prior, and since her arrival, we had observed peculiar incidents. Initially, there were pamphlets placed beneath our entrance gate regarding landscaping infractions, followed by HOA newsletters appearing in our mailbox addressed to us as if we had mysteriously become members. But today represented a complete invasion. Karen's SUV squealed to a halt before the stable like she was law enforcement in a pursuit. She threw open her door and strutted out wearing a tan business suit that likely exceeded my entire animal feed expenses. Leah stood peacefully beside the chicken enclosure, clutching a partially filled feed container with a puzzled look on her face. Karen wasted no time beginning her verbal assault. She declared the stable's crimson paint conflicted with the community's visual appeal, claimed the livestock odor constituted an environmental violation, and argued that the metal rooster weather vane atop our residence was an unauthorized addition. Then she had the audacity to indicate our cattle fencing and label it dangerous to neighborhood youth. My wife, bless her soul, maintained her composure, never raised her voice, even when Karen gestured so frantically that papers flew from her grasp into a water container. Lee simply stated in that perfectly composed rancher manner, "Mom, you're approximately 300 yards beyond your authority." But Karen wasn't paying attention. She continued her tirade, her face reddening as she hurled insults at my wife that would result in banishment from a church gathering. Then suddenly, she produced a laminated document, an actual laminated list, and began reciting alleged infractions. She insisted we were violating CHUA Section 7th Visual Harmony regulations. My wife blinked and I approached asking, "What harmony? This is a ranch. Our harmony incorporates cowbells and diesel fuel." The Karen didn't appreciate that response. She redirected her fury toward me, demanding we follow the HOA's requirements or face penalties and court action. I told her directly that we weren't members of her HOA. We had owned this property long before our identical neighborhood ever broke ground. That's when the situation deteriorated further. She pulled out her phone and started filming, creating some distorted narrative about us refusing compliance, labeling us as hostile rural resistors who threatened community solidarity. She aimed her device at our goats as if their mere presence constituted criminal proof. It would have been amusing if it weren't so offensive. Leah requested once more, politely but firmly, that she exit our land. Instead, Karen marched straight to the stable doors, peered inside, and mumbled something about filing a noise violation regarding the tractor. That's when our ranch dog Bear, a great Pyrenees with a saint's patience and thunder's bark, decided enough was sufficient. He positioned himself between Karen and Leah, not threatening, just motionless and enormous, emanating calm dominance. Karen screamed, retreated, and accused us of possessing an unlicensed attack dog. I intervened before things became more ridiculous. I opened the entrance, gestured toward the gravel path she had arrived on, and said, "Return the way you came, ma'am, and don't return unless you've brought baked goods and an apology." She stormed to her SUV, but rather than departing, she marched back and positioned herself at the property boundary as if summoning some supernatural guide. "You believe this is finished?" she yelled. "You don't understand who I am." My wife simply responded, "We don't care about your identity, we know our location. This land doesn't belong to you." Karen jumped into her SUV, threw it in reverse, and kicked up another dust storm before racing away in a trail of indignation and poorly executed fury. Later that afternoon, as we relaxed on the porch with cold lemonades and disbelief, Lee turned to me and said, "You realize she'll return?" I agreed. People like Karen don't simply abandon things. They intensify, they organize gatherings, they weaponize neighborhood social media groups. I could already envision the fraudulent penalties, the reports to zoning officials, and the HOA bulletins filled with veiled intimidation. But what Karen failed to understand, what she still hadn't comprehended, was that we weren't frightened of her position or her outbursts. We possessed the law supporting us, the ground under our feet, and a 10-foot barrier that could halt a cattle herd. And if circumstances became desperate, we had something additional. A lake, a large muddy fish-filled lake just yards from the gravel road where she parked. That evening I looked over at the winch equipment positioned by the stable, and for the first time in weeks I grinned. Karen had just initiated a conflict she wasn't prepared for. She had brought documentation to a place where we resolve issues with cables, barriers, and direct communication. But if she desired drama, she was about to receive it. and the next time she set foot on this ranch, she wouldn't just depart with a warning. She might leave with soaked footwear and a very puzzling call to her insurance representative. The morning following Karen's ranch explosion, we assumed the tempest had subsided. Most reasonable individuals, after screaming themselves hoarse and nearly being barked off the premises by a calf-sized dog, would have retreated into obscurity, perhaps even taken an extended rest and reconsidered their life decisions. But not Karen. By the time we were brewing coffee and feeding the chickens, a new form of absurdity had materialized. Our mailbox had been crammed not with regular mail or advertisements, but with a fluorescent pink envelope sealed in what appeared to be glittery duct tape. Leah opened it, hesitating only because it sparkled like a Lisa Frank notebook from the 90s. Inside was a 3-page typed document titled Official Cho Warning of Compliance Breach, listing fabricated violations, threatening escalating penalties, and attaching a $150 fine for our use of agricultural infrastructure on residential adjacent properties. It was absurd, dramatic, and legally worthless, but it was merely the beginning. That same day we noticed something odd. A neighbor from down the road, Margaret, a kind woman who always delivered pecan pies during harvest season, was suddenly cold and distant. When Lee waved at her on the road, Margaret looked away and drove past as if we had insulted her family. Later, a friend at the feed store mentioned there was discussion in the local Facebook group, mostly from AOE members, about our ranch being uncontrolled and causing distress to the subdivision. Karen, it appeared, had launched a digital defamation campaign complete with manipulated photographs of our stable, close-ups of a damaged fence post, and even a post claiming we were illegally breeding livestock for profit. That last one had Leah laughing so hard she nearly dropped a hay bundle. "If they think I'm operating some underground goat business, I should start charging admission," she muttered. Still, it was more aggravating than amusing when an animal control officer appeared unannounced the following day. He was courteous enough but clearly uncomfortable as he explained that someone had submitted an anonymous report about unhealthy livestock conditions. Lee showed him the stables, the veterinary records, the clean stalls, and the ridiculously pampered goats with their own designated cooling fans. The inspector departed apologetically, muttering something about how Karen's name kept appearing on his list recently. That's when we realized she wasn't just attempting to intimidate us with paper threats, she was trying to bury us in red tape. A few days later the nonsense escalated. I returned from a supply trip to find the entrance open, our private property, no trespassing, sign missing, and one of our calves wandering near the roadway. We examined the security camera and captured a blurry image of someone cutting the gate chain in broad daylight. Parked half on the utility road and half on our pasture grass was Karen's SUV. The audacious part, she left it there while she marched around the property's side as if she owned it. When Lee confronted her, Karen claimed she was conducting a visual inspection for the HOA's Community Harmony Subcommittee. My wife told her if she didn't leave within 60 seconds, she'd face the wrong end of a manure hose. Karen muttered something about us being hostile and said she would escalate this to the board. She departed in a huff, but not before photographing our stable, our cattle, and somehow our water hose as if it were a crime scene. The breaking point arrived with the fence. One morning, we discovered the north side of the boundary fence removed and replaced with a shiny HOA-styled vinyl version, white, decorative, and completely useless for containing cattle. Someone had excavated our posts, removed our barbed wire, and left behind a note stapled to a wooden stake reading, "For safety, aesthetics, and HOA compliance." It wasn't just vandalism, it was invasion. We contacted the sheriff, who arrived and looked visibly exhausted when we explained it. "Karen again?" he asked before we even finished. He examined the fence, shook his head, and said, "That woman doesn't understand where the boundary ends." Literally, he filed a report, confirmed our boundaries were untouched by HOA authority, and said that technically Karen was trespassing every time she drove on that utility road. That's when Leah became quiet, not angry, just focused. She was thinking. That afternoon, a retired neighbor named Tom arrived in his golf cart and parked himself under our porch shade with sweet tea in hand. Tom was known for being the unofficial gossip messenger of the area, but this time he brought more than chatter. He had minutes from the last OA board meeting, which he managed to obtain from an accidentally forwarded email. In it, Karen had presented something called the Property Expansion Initiative. The objective? Expand the HOA's legal boundaries by pushing an annexation proposal through a quiet county planning session. She was targeting 3 land parcels including ours. The catch was that annexation required voluntary agreement by landowners or proof that the land violated safety codes, which would allow the HOA to argue for forced compliance. Karen was attempting to manufacture that proof. All the fraudulent citations, animal control visits, Facebook rumors. It was a paper trail designed to justify a hostile takeover of our property into the HOA's control. Now everything made sense. She wasn't just nosy or controlling, she was on a mission. And she had underestimated exactly what kind of people she was dealing with. Lee might have appeared like a quiet ranch wife, but she had grown up rebuilding her family's farmland after a tornado destroyed it. She once filed 6 legal claims in a single day when a developer tried to build over her family's well. She had determination, intelligence, and absolutely no tolerance for someone threatening her home. We knew what we needed to do next. First, we put the sheriff's trespassing report to good use and posted laminated copies along the fence line. Second, we installed security cameras that sent footage directly to our phones with motion detection alerts. Third, we reinstalled our old winch equipment and parked it right by the lake near the access road Karen kept using. Then Lee had one final touch. She laminated a fresh sign reading, "Warning, vehicles left on property will be moved at owner's risk. Lake depth 14 feet. It was bold, perfectly legal, and undeniably clear. By nightfall, Karen had driven by twice, circling like a confused hawk seeking prey. But this time we were ready. The land wasn't just defended by wire and signs. It was now backed by facts, footage, and a level of petty patience only ranchers could master. Karen wanted a fight, she had one. She brought forms and highway manuals, we brought cables, steel, and a lake with Karen's name unofficially reserved on the bottom. And the next time her tires touched our grass, they wouldn't be rolling away dry. They'd be floating toward a lesson she wouldn't forget. Sunday morning arrived quiet and golden with the kind of stillness that always preceded something stirring up dust on the ranch. The birds were singing, the cattle were lazily stretching and nudging around the feeding area, and there it was, sitting exactly where we expected it to be. Karen's glossy pearl-white SUV gleamed in the sunrise like a misplaced trophy. She had parked even farther in than usual this time, 2 wheels deep into our grass, not even pretending to stay on the edge of the gravel road. My wife stood beside me on the porch, sipping her coffee and nodding slowly as if mentally reviewing a to-do list. Next to her was our tow equipment, a reinforced steel frame truck with a heavy-duty winch we'd used to drag a stuck hay trailer from the creek last winter. She didn't speak at first, just set her coffee down, adjusted her work gloves, and said, "Let's get this thing moving." I backed the tow equipment into position while Lee unspooled the winch cable, threading it under the fence through a panel we'd opened earlier. She didn't look angry, just focused. For her, this wasn't revenge, it was cleanup, just another chore on a list that had taken too long to cross off. We secured the hook underneath the SUV's frame with practiced ease. It didn't even have a locking mechanism engaged. Karen had clearly assumed she was immune to consequences. As I tightened the cable, I noticed something ridiculous. She'd left a framed OH citation on the dashboard facing outward, as if to declare her dominance over ranch land with laminated paper and suburban rage. My wife looked at it, snorted, and said, "Hope she enjoys the view from the bottom." We gave one last look around to ensure there were no hikers or children in the vicinity. The lake wasn't huge, but it was deep, especially near the spot where the old irrigation trench had collapsed years ago. I climbed back into the equipment and slowly started driving forward, pulling the winch cable taut. The SUV jerked, then rolled smoothly across the grass. Its tires bumped lightly over the edge of the slope, and then gravity took over. It picked up speed as it neared the lake, the angle working in our favor. My wife walked alongside it, holding the winch control remote, guiding it like a parade float. The splash was louder than I expected, a satisfying cinematic plunge followed by the hiss of bubbles and the slow bobbing of the SUV's front end. It didn't sink all at once, just hovered as if shocked at what had just happened. Then slowly it tilted, dipped nose first, and disappeared under the surface with a final gurgle. We stood in silence for a moment, watching the ripples smooth out. Then we heard it, the sound of high-pitched yelling coming from up the hill. I didn't even need to look to know it was her. Karen had arrived right on cue. She came racing down the slope in another car, a rental by the looks of it. And when she saw the empty space where her SUV used to be, she stopped mid-run and screamed so loud it startled the cattle in the next field. She didn't see the lake at first, but when she did, she stood frozen for a second, then marched toward us like she was about to perform an exorcism. "You maniacs! You criminals! That vehicle cost more than this entire property." My wife calmly stepped between Karen and the lake, not out of fear, but because she refused to let Karen step one more inch onto our land. Karen's face turned red, then purple. She pointed toward the lake and shouted, "You'll pay for this! This is a federal offense!" I responded from the truck window. "Actually, trespassing is. You've been warned repeatedly." That SUV was illegally parked on private land. Karen's eyes darted between us, her rage building like a kettle about to blow. "I had every right. I was performing a community inspection. You destroyed HOA property." My wife took out her phone and pressed play on a recording. Karen's voice came through clearly from a previous rant saying, "I'll park wherever I want. It's all part of my view rights." Karen didn't like that. She slapped the phone out of Leah's hand, which was a bad move. The sheriff had told us in advance that we were allowed to document any harassment or illegal behavior. That slap just added assault to the list. I pulled my phone and called Deputy Parks immediately. "You might want to swing by," I said. "She's here, she's loud," and now she slapped a phone out of Leah's hand. Karen tried to grab the phone from me too, but I held it out of reach and warned her not to take another step. She backed off, trembling with fury, and then pulled out her own phone. "I'm calling my lawyer. You'll regret this. You have no idea who you're messing with." That line again. She always said that, like she was the boss of some secret organization that operated above local law. 20 minutes later, Deputy Parks rolled in slow and calm as ever. He looked at the tire marks, the lake, the soggy grass, and Karen still yelling near the shoreline. Then he raised an eyebrow and said, "Wes, that view rights thing didn't hold up too well." Karen exploded. She demanded an arrest, pointed at us like we were international fugitives, and screamed that the sheriff was in on some conspiracy. Parks just asked her for documentation proving jurisdiction. She showed him her HOA badge. He laughed. Then he turned to us and asked, "Did you give her permission to park here?" "Nope," we said in unison. Karen tried one last desperate move. She said the lake was a public waterway and that our actions endangered community property. That was when my wife calmly produced a laminated deed map showing the lake was 100% private. The look on Karen's face could have soared milk. Deputy Parks shook his head and said, "Mom, this is private land. You've been trespassing for weeks. These folks have video, audio, and a long list of complaints filed." Karen's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. Finally, she muttered something about suing everyone, including the sheriff's department, and stomped back to her rental car. As she peeled off down the road, I turned to my wife and said, "Think she'll be back?" She smirked and said, "Not unless she brings scuba gear." So we stood there for a while, looking at the lake, now calm again, the SUV resting at the bottom like a monument to entitlement. For the first time in weeks, the air felt clear. No more surprise inspections, no more bogus fines, just the sweet smell of grass, the distant mooing of cows, and the quiet satisfaction that comes when someone finally learns a lesson in boundaries the hard way. And if Karen didn't learn it yet, well, we still had plenty of rope and an old winch that worked like a charm. For the first 2 days after the SUV plunge, we thought we had seen the last of Karen. The road stayed quiet, the mailbox was blessedly free of glittery violation notices, and even our goats seemed less agitated. It was almost peaceful. My wife resumed her morning garden routine, and I finally got a chance to finish resealing the tool shed, a job that had been postponed for weeks due to Karen's constant drama. The tension we'd lived under for nearly a month seemed to dissipate into the June breeze. But we both knew it was too quiet. And if there was one thing Karen couldn't stand more than being ignored, it was being humiliated. She wasn't going to go down without launching something noisy and entirely unnecessary. It started with a live stream. One of the neighbors from the subdivision sent us a link early Monday morning with the words, "You've got to see this." Karen had gone live on some HF Facebook page, standing on her back patio with a makeshift podium, a stack of documents, and the self-importance of someone about to announce national emergency measures. She was wearing a power blazer, oversized sunglasses, and standing next to a poster board that read Community Integrity Emergency. Her opening words were, "We are under attack by lawless fringe landowners who have no respect for shared values." Then she played heavily edited footage of herself yelling at us from earlier encounters, cutting out every bit where she trespassed, cursed, or slapped at phones. She claimed we were environmental hazards, visual polluters, and, our personal favorite, landscape anarchists. The comments on the video were a mix of concerned HOA members nodding along and others laughing hysterically, especially when she tried to claim her SUV had been swept away by an illegal lake current. We were stunned at the lengths she was going to, but then came the twist. During the live stream, Karen announced she had retained legal counsel and was filing a civil lawsuit against us for destruction of property, emotional distress, and endangerment. She even pulled out what she claimed were photos of her car underwater, photos that were clearly taken with a long lens from outside our fence. It wasn't just a grudge anymore. Karen was building a crusade. What she didn't know was that the sheriff's office had already reviewed the footage we gave them. They had determined that she had repeatedly trespassed, received multiple verbal and written warnings, and was the one who had violated private property boundaries. She also didn't know that her entire HA board was quietly preparing a mutiny behind her back. Over the next few days, we started receiving anonymous emails, screenshots of internal HOA group chats, and even handwritten notes slid under our gate. Several board members had grown tired of Karen's antics, especially after the SUV incident went viral and local news picked up the story. Apparently, HOA meetings had devolved into shouting matches with Karen doubling down and accusing her fellow board members of conspiring with the countryside. Then came the board meeting. It was scheduled for Thursday evening, held in the clubhouse of the subdivision we weren't part of. The HOA had no obligation to attend, but we were invited anyway, anonymously, with a note that read, "Bring popcorn." My wife and I decided to watch from a distance. We parked just outside the subdivision and walked in with a few neighbors we knew from town. The meeting room was packed, cameras were rolling, residents lined the walls, and Karen was already at the front, pacing like a nervous theater director. She had a slideshow ready on a projector, complete with bullet points, grainy photos of our livestock, and a dramatic title slide that read, "The Rural Threat." Her presentation was everything we expected, long, loud, and laced with misinformation. She accused us of poisoning the community vibe, showed drone footage of our barn, and called it an affront to neighborhood harmony. She even showed a stock photo of a cow and claimed it was ours, saying it had glared menacingly at children. We might have laughed out loud if we weren't so stunned at how deep her delusions ran. But the audience wasn't buying it. The room shifted and murmurs turned into interruptions. One man in the back stood up and said, "This isn't a legal case. This is your ego bleeding out." A woman nearby followed with, "You forged that letter you sent to the county. We saw the watermark." That was when the board president, someone who had once supported Karen, stood up and called for a vote. Not on us, on her. The motion was to remove Karen Hallbrook from her position as SHE president effective immediately, citing abuse of authority, misuse of funds, and community defamation. The vote wasn't even close, 32 in favor, 2 against. Karen stood frozen, blinking rapidly like the room had suddenly tilted. Then, in typical fashion, she refused to leave. She ranted about legal recourse, threatened to report the entire community, and finally stormed out after someone threatened to call security. We thought it would end there, but the very next morning, as we were feeding the horses, Karen appeared once more. She was driving a different vehicle, a rental again, and pulled up along the gravel road, this time staying just outside the property line. She rolled down her window, held up a thick envelope, and shouted, "You've been served." The envelope landed in the dirt near our fence and she sped off. Inside was a stack of poorly copied documents allegedly representing her lawsuit, but the address listed for the court didn't even exist. The law firm was fake. One of the pages still had a Google Docs formatting note on it. She had faked a lawsuit the same way she faked her show citations, with confidence in a printer. Deputy Parks came by later that afternoon after we called it in. He picked up the documents, flipped through them. "This one's my favorite," he said, holding up a page with the heading, Article 7 Rural Visual Offenses. He asked if we wanted to press charges for continued harassment and trespassing. My wife looked out at the lake and said, let's give her one last out. If she comes back again, then yes. But this time let her stew. That weekend, a local news station ran a story titled, "Oh, President Ousted After SUV Ends Up in Rancher's Lake." They interviewed residents, featured footage of Karen's meltdown at the board meeting, and even included a brief interview with Deputy Parks, who diplomatically described the events as severe misinterpretation of jurisdiction. From then on, the messages from neighbors started pouring in: apologies, baked goods, even invitations to community barbecues. Some said they'd been manipulated by Karen's charm and constant pressure. Others admitted they were just scared to speak out, but now with her gone, they wanted to make things right. It was odd going from pariah to honorary guests in the same neighborhood that once considered our cattle a menace. But my wife, always the grace over grudges type, accepted their gestures. Still, she kept the winch cable clean and coiled just in case Karen decided to test her luck again. Because in this story, the lake didn't just hold a sunken SUV, it held a memory, a boundary, and a message that screamed louder than Karen ever could. The week that followed was the quietest we'd had in months. No SUVs parked illegally, no screaming down the road, no absurd fines taped to our gate. Karen had vanished, at least temporarily, and the sense of calm on the ranch was almost suspicious. My wife joked that we should mount a plaque near the lake that read, "Here lies entitlement." Even the animals seemed to feel the change. The goats stopped trying to climb fences like they were part of some organized protest. The cattle grazed with the peaceful assurance of livestock who knew no clipboards were being waved at them. For the first time in a long while, it felt like we could just exist. But we weren't naive. We knew people like Karen didn't disappear forever. They had regrouped, and always came back when they thought they had a new angle or a fresh weapon. And sure enough, she wasn't done. It happened the following Friday. A county official showed up unannounced around noon with a clipboard and a very confused expression. His name was Marvin, and he was from the zoning office. Said he'd received an anonymous complaint about unpermitted structures, offensive visual clutter, and aggressive wildlife practices. The words practically dripped off his tongue like they were unfamiliar. He apologized for the surprise visit and asked if we wouldn't mind walking the property with him. My wife didn't even blink. She invited him inside for lemonade first, then walked him through every barn, shed, fence, and corner of the ranch. Marvin couldn't find a single violation. He was polite, even sheepish by the end. When we asked if he'd mind telling us who filed the complaint, he admitted, "I'm not supposed to say, but let's just say her first name starts with a K and her last name sounds like fall down a well." We both laughed. What Marvin did share, though, was something that surprised us. Karen had filed nearly a dozen complaints under different names against properties near ours. Most had been tossed out, but 3 had made it into inspection status. She'd used fake addresses and even listed herself as a witness in multiple forms. She was trying to stir up chaos from the shadows now that her OA throne had crumbled. That night, Lee sat on the porch with her journal, flipping pages and thinking. "She's not going to stop," she said finally. "She'll keep doing this until someone stops her for good." I nodded, sipping my coffee, watching the moonlight shimmer on the lake where Karen's SUV rested in silence. "Then maybe it's time we go from reactive to proactive," I said. "Let's give her one final push over the cliff she's dangling from." The opportunity came faster than expected. We got a call from a local reporter who had seen the viral videos and read about the HOA board collapse. She was doing a feature on rural property rights and wanted to interview us about what happened. My wife hesitated at first, but after a long pause, she agreed. She said it wasn't about revenge. It was about warning others. If Karen was willing to lie, forge complaints, harass, and bully people with fake power, she could do it to someone else who didn't have a strong fence and a winch. The reporter came out 2 days later, and the interview was everything we hoped. Honest, calm, and grounded in fact. My wife walked her through the ranch, showed her the paperwork proving we were outside show jurisdiction, and even played clips from Karen's rants. The piece aired the following Sunday. By Monday, it had over 3 million views and a trending hashtag for Lake Karen. The floodgates opened after that. People from all over the country began sharing their own HOA nightmare stories. Karen became a symbol, an avatar of overreach and ego dressed in business casual. It wasn't just a story anymore, it was a movement. Within a week, the county commission announced a review of HOA policies and borders in the area. Karen was officially blacklisted from the county planning council, where she'd apparently been trying to worm her way in as a community advisor. A deeper investigation began into her previous OA conduct, and it turned out she'd misappropriated funds for personal use, charging extravagant meals and unnecessary landscaping to the OA budget. The last time we saw her in person was both poetic and slightly sad. It was a Wednesday morning, and I was out by the lake clearing some reeds when I heard a car pull up at the far edge of the gravel. I looked up, and there she was, standing next to her rental again. This time she wasn't yelling. She wasn't holding any papers. She was just staring at the water, arms crossed, face unreadable. My wife joined me and we both walked toward her slowly, staying on our side of the fence. Karen glanced at us but didn't speak. After a few seconds she asked, "Is it still down there?" Leah nodded. "Yep. Insurance wouldn't even cover it once they saw the trespassing footage." Karen looked back at the lake. "You ruined me," she said, almost like it was a quiet confession. My wife tilted her head slightly and replied, "You did that to yourself. We just stopped you from ruining anyone else." Karen didn't respond. She turned, got back in her car and drove away. We haven't seen her since. Word is she moved to another state, trying to restart her life in a new community with no OAs. A few folks from the subdivision told us she tried to sue the HOA for wrongful removal, But the case was thrown out almost immediately. Now her name was more infamous than influential. She'd become the cautionary tale, the woman who thought she could bend private land to her will and ended up sinking her own reputation instead. The weeks that followed were filled with repair and restoration. Not to the ranch, that had always held strong, but to the relationships with our neighbors. People who had once kept their distance now stopped by to chat, to offer eggs or jam, or simply to thank us for standing firm. The HOA elected a new board, one that was more interested in maintaining community gardens than terrorizing property lines. My wife was even offered a spot on the county land committee to help advise on boundary integrity and rural rights. She accepted, not for politics but for peace. One evening, as we sat by the porch watching the sun dip low and orange across the hills, Lee leaned over and said, "You know, I still can't believe we had to tow an SUV into a lake to get here." I laughed and replied, "Sometimes the quickest path to peace is paved with splash damage." The winch was back in storage, the signs had been replaced with new ones that simply read, "Respect the fence," and the ranch returned to what it was always meant to be, a place of work, peace, and occasional goat-based chaos. Karen may have started a war, but it was her own arrogance that buried her in the mud. And as the seasons rolled on and the lake settled into stillness again, one truth remained as steady as the earth beneath our boots. Some boundaries don't need a fence, they just need to be defended once, loudly enough that no one dares cross them again.